here are the topics for tonight. You can see that we're going to cover a lot, but really we're breaking this into two sections. What to do when things are good. So hopefully that's the case for many people right now. But we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about what to do when your parent is deteriorating, because there are a lot of different things that you want to do at that point. So with that, I just want to share a quick background on myself. I am a financial planner. I don't work exclusively with widows and caregivers, but that is who I focus on. I was a caregiver to my dad for 7 years. I would call myself a secondary caregiver. My parents were divorced at a young age, but remained friends. My mom was really the primary caregiver, and I was in the same location as my dad for many years and moved across the country. So did some caregiving remotely as well, which is a different dynamic and a challenge in itself. I am an only child for the most part. If someone wants a longer story, I'm happy to share that. I'm also married to a fellow in cardiology, and I just mentioned that because I have some background knowledge about how the medical system works as well, with a wife at home that I can ask these questions to. And then personally, some things that I like to do and unwind. And I think it's important to share because anybody on a caregiving journey, you need to still make time for those things, as hard as it is. So with that, Ryan, this is yours.
Yeah. So we want to just set up kind of the different situations. So I'm going to share an experience that I've been having, and then Elliott's going to share an experience that he's been having. So this is just a visual cue. I don't think any of you needed a visual for the state of Tennessee, but I got a phone call in, I believe it was March, from a very good friend of mine who lives in Memphis. And she's like, Ryan, I don't know what to do. You're a financial planner. I thought you were the person to call. Okay, what's going on? She had gotten a call from her dad's financial planner, who she also had a small account with. And he was like, your dad has been asking for irregular withdrawals, things that are beyond the scope of what he normally withdraws. And when I'm asking him what it's for, he's being very evasive. I'm not even supposed to be calling you because I don't have a reason to, but I'm calling you. My friend jumps into the situation. She tries to get information from her dad. She gets stonewalled. The advisor calls her a week later. Another $25,000 has gone out of the account. He's asked for another withdrawal. And she's like, stop. He doesn't know what he's doing. And she has no power to stop the situation. She drives from Memphis to Knoxville, which you will notice is the clear other end of the state. And if you've ever driven west to east across Tennessee, it is very large. She drives there. She's talking to her dad. She's trying to figure out what's going on. He explains to her that he has won the Publishers Clearinghouse. And that's why he has to take some of this money out, because to process it, he has to pay some taxes on it by mailing checks off to a P.O. box in the Bronx. She says, Dad, this is a scam. Please stop. He does not stop. We'll fast forward. The punchline here is that he's given away all of his retirement accounts. I don't know the exact balance, but multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was actively telling the banks and the investment manager, please don't do this, but she did not have power of attorney. She did not have any ability to stop this. She didn't have access to his accounts. She was telling them, like, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's being scammed, and it didn't matter. He took out a home equity line of credit on his house. So she actually at one point opened up accounts in his name illegally, tried to move his money into those accounts. None of these are things I would necessarily recommend. And once his money was kind of segregated, the money that she was able to segregate to the side, he then went to a bank and borrowed money and somehow was able to borrow, take a home equity line on his house, which was the one remaining asset that he had. So my friends who live in Memphis went from having a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old to now being the legal guardians, a conservatorship of her 80-year-old father. They've moved him to Memphis. That's the last I heard was a couple of weeks ago that they moved him to Memphis, which was obviously not an easy situation. This is a man who has a law degree, had a 30 plus year successful career, ran a business, like all those things. But like dementia is very literally, you are not the person that you once were. He has been diagnosed with dementia. He is not accepting that diagnosis, but he has been diagnosed with dementia. So this is just a situation that I've seen play out in kind of the worst possible way. And what it brought home for me is that for many of us here, the biggest risk to our finances is something like this happening with our parents' finances, because it's one of the biggest things that can happen that can derail kind of your, not just money, but also time, emotional energy too. So that's one scenario. And then I'm going to turn it over to Elliott just to share another very different scenario. But a lot of the best practices that would work for either of the two scenarios that we're talking about, even though they're pretty different.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yep.
So I want to talk a little bit about my dad's progression, because each phase was a little bit different for him. And I want to do this visually just so you can see how my dad changed over that time period. Sometimes this is a drastic change. Sometimes it takes a long time to happen. So this was in 2014, my dad and I at a Seattle Mariners baseball game. You can see he's looking pretty healthy, no diagnosis at this point. 2016, he gets diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer and kind of hits the lottery in terms of cancer survival rate. Survival rate at that time for someone with stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis is about 6 months. As you can see, we have quite a few years on here. So he, in other words, won the lung cancer lottery, but things didn't go real smoothly the entire time. You can see back at a Mariners game, this was a Father's Day tradition for him and me. Looking pretty healthy at the time. He was taking a drug called Keytruda that was very, very effective. It's a targeted therapy and worked really well for him. This is in 2018. We are at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. And to make a longer story short, he ended up tripping over one of those really tiny ledges that connect carpet and hardwood and ended up breaking his hip. So spent some time at the hospital getting his hip repaired. And that was sort of the end of active treatment for him. And I'd really say this was more or less a turning point for us. 2019, he had a low sodium event. For anybody who's ever experienced that, delusions come on and it's really hard to figure out what's going on. Sometimes it feels like a UTI or something else. 2020, fast forward to the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the porch visit. So that added another layer of caregiving and keeping your loved ones safe and everything that went into that. 2021, I moved across the country. As I mentioned, my wife graduated medical school. We moved across the country for residency. This is my dad. You can see he's got a knee brace on, a cane. Health is declining slowly but surely here. 2022, he's back in the hospital, has a really, really long stay at the hospital for this time period. And then 2023, this is a video call with my dad about a week before he dies. So you can see I'm pretty darn exhausted down here. If you can see me down there, we've been through a lot at this point. My dad struggled with substance use issues. He started using again, and that's what sort of landed him back in the hospital, was taking out thousands of dollars a week. So similar to Ryan's story, even though I was durable power of attorney, you don't have a lot of control over what someone does with their money unless you have conservatorship, and that has its own issues as well. And then in 2023, a few weeks later after this photo was taken, we are spreading his ashes at the beach. So this is a visual representation of my journey. Embedded in there are month-long hospital stays, DKA for diabetes, kicked out of assisted living within 48 hours of moving him in. That was a $6,000 to $7,000 experience, and a very unfortunate one, and one at which point I actually cut off contact with my dad at some point. And we're going to talk about boundaries tonight and how hard that can be. My mom and I had many conversations and both stepped back from caregiving at certain points, and that was a very, very challenging thing to do, but the right thing at the time. And that is another thing to keep in mind as you go through and we talk about your parent deteriorating. Setting boundaries is important, and that's something I talk about regularly with my clients and people I'm working with. So with that, we'll keep going here. I'm curious, you've heard Ryan and my story. What do you think about when you hear the term aging? Feel free to just drop that down in the chat. We're going to give it maybe a minute or so here just to see what comes to mind. Losing freedom, independence, memory loss. Loss of autonomy, yeah. Bitterness, yep. Fear, yeah. You all are really encompassing what it means. Stubbornness, yeah.
That's an important one. Thanks, Trey.
Yeah. This all bring me back for, my dad was of a generation, I'm sure many of us have that, where you are stubborn, you have your independence, and you lose a lot of that during that. And it was interesting to watch how he allowed us to step in at certain points, not always, to go ahead and help with things. Second childhood, yeah, particularly at the end, as you start to have memory issues. That was a big one for my dad. It was akin to essentially treating them like a kid. And I'll talk a little bit about software we installed on my dad's phone that is literally child software. So I appreciate everybody sharing. We'll keep going. We have some more questions throughout the presentation here. So let's talk about when things are good. And hopefully a lot of you are in this position now, but I would say start the conversation early. And I've got 5 techniques. If someone has another, feel free to throw it in the chat. But these are the 5 that we're going to talk about in a little more detail here. And I have specific quotes. I think the hardest thing that a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I'm not quite sure how to bring this up. I have specific language. So when Ryan shares these slides, you can actually use these quotes verbatim as you have this conversation or tweak it to your own style. So I like to use the example of use your own plan. Opportunity to share with your parents. Hey, I updated this. My in case of emergency binder is located here. In case something happens to me, I want you to know where it is. And that's a perfect opportunity to say, hey, do you have an updated will, a DPOA, an advanced healthcare directive? And where is it? Where might I find it? Is it in the safe deposit box? Usually not a great place to have those things because they're hard to access. Is it at some sort of vault at your house? If so, what's the password? Or is it, if it's an important shelf, maybe it's back there. Where actually is it? You want to know the location, because when things happen really quickly. And it's hard during those times to figure out. You don't want to be running around the house trying to figure out where that is. So use your own planning as an opportunity to bring up this conversation. So mentioning a news article, share a story about a family. Maybe they didn't have their credit frozen and that led to identity theft. That's a really common thing as people start to age, that credit card gets taken out in their name, or someone opens up a line of credit like Ryan talked about. That can be a really lengthy process to resolve. So go through those Wall Street Journal, New York Times articles, anything out there, any of the horror stories. Use that. Maybe don't start with the horror stories, use something more neutral, but you could certainly use that if that is top of mind, and fear is a good strategy with your parent. You know them best.
Use the anecdote that I just shared. They probably won't love it, but it's real. Yeah. And they probably have a friend or a colleague or a family member that makes them think of.
Definitely. And that brings us to the next point. Tell a story about a friend. It doesn't have to be a real friend. It can be a make-believe friend. You can make up a total story, but say how they had investment accounts at different locations and they weren't quite sure how to communicate with multiple financial institutions and get that resolved. So use that as you can. Tell those stories. Stories are really powerful motivators as we talk about this, as opposed to a statistic. If I told you, and I'm just going to make something up, 70% of people aging experience identity theft, that's not real impactful. But if I told you my friend Jane had her identity stolen and she spent 100 hours on the phone and she had $30,000 stolen from her that she'll never get back, that's a different conversation and a different listening for the person receiving it. I also like to bring it up while doing an activity. And my joke here is nobody likes to sit down and go, hey, mom and dad, if you get sick, what do you want to have happen? Or how should this be? Most people are not going to be receptive to that. I know I foolishly did this at times with my dad, and nothing really led to a good outcome. So I always like to do it while you have your hands busy or you're doing something else. I just threw some things on there, but if your family's into game nights, do it over that and maybe set the stage in advance that you want to talk about something important. I find when you're not just staring across from someone directly, it can help if they have some sort of outlet while you're having, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. And chances are people have not had this conversation in the past. And so
a lot of therapists' office have, little things to play with in your hands, little like slinkies or other little trinkets. And like, this is the same idea of like, if you just give something to take 10% of their focus to somewhere else, you can probably get a lot further than if you're like, let's sit on the couch and stare at each other and talk about your demise.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan. Or reference this talk. This is a perfect opportunity to say, hey, I went to this talk by someone who had a pretty awful 7 years caregiving for his dad. There were some bright shining parts during that as well, but for the most part, it was pretty downright awful. And use my story as an example, and the mistakes that we made or things that didn't go as smoothly. And I'm happy to elaborate that in part of the Q&A. I've left a lot of that out just for purposes of time, but reference this talk. I think this is a perfect opportunity that needs to get talked about more. And this is a good way to start the conversation. So as you think about your own parents, each parent is different. I've shared about my dad here. Think about your own mom, dad, family friend, aunt, uncle, whoever you might step in as a caregiver for. Which do you think would be the best strategy to mention if you were to bring this conversation up with them? Feel free to throw it in the chat. I'd be curious to see what people come up with and what the majority is. Stories.
The people they know is really critical. Is like they're not unaware this is happening. Get my sister to do it. We can do it with your sister. That's what you meant. Yeah.
Okay. We'll keep going. Yeah. Mentioning this talk. Yeah. Reference this talk. That's great. I love that so many people might mention this talk. That pleases me just because there aren't a lot of opportunities for these conversations. I've found in my own experiences, I shared more of my caregiving journey. A lot of people shared in return experiences they had been through. So I'd encourage you as you go through your journey, maybe to share with other folks, even though it can be uncomfortable and different. I find it's a good outlet for people who've been through a similar experience, and it's a good learning opportunity. That's how I picked up a lot of things that we're talking about tonight.
One of the things is, oftentimes you have one parent who is in a caregiving role to another parent, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that means they will then probably someday go through a similar experience, probably obviously not the exact same, but making sure that you find ways to hold space for that caregiver and say, okay, you're going through this now. What are we learning that we could do differently when this is you, if this is ever you, and how do we make sure that it's as smooth as possible, because there won't be another person if they're married. There's lessons to be learned if this is, your parents are together and they're going to do this twice.
Definitely. Okay. Let's talk about some important documents. My guess is you've probably talked about some of these with Ryan, but I'd like to talk about it from the lens of you are now the son or daughter, and how do we talk about these with our parents and not just accept the conversation of, do you have a will or trust? Great. Check the box, moving on. We want to dig a little bit deeper because the details are what matter here when it comes down to it, if they were to pass away or something, or they became incapacitated. So talking about the will or trust, some things that I see commonly go wrong here is if they set up the trust, did the trust actually get funded? And this is really important in states where probate is an expensive or time-consuming process. For example, people out in California, as an example, most people have assets in a trust because of that. And it can be pretty challenging if, say, a stray bank account didn't get actually funded into the trust, or the home didn't get put into the trust. So making sure that if they do have it, don't just accept from your parent, hey, we have a trust. That's not enough. Say, are all your assets that should be in the trust actually in the trust? And maybe that's worth a conversation with the estate planning attorney. Maybe you want to go to that meeting and frame it just as, hey, I'm just hoping to learn for my own knowledge or make sure I have an understanding of what my role might be in the future.
I want to just throw in one thing. I'm sorry, Elliott. Zoom
I love it. Go for it.
each other. I have a client experience of a person passing away in California, and it being 2.5 years, roughly, from person passing away to probate closing. And there was active efforts throughout that 2.5 years. It wasn't we were ignoring this. It was active efforts to get it closed. California is a particularly difficult state. Every state is not as difficult. In fact, it's probably the most difficult state, but those details really, really matter. And so I have heard certainly anecdotes of yeah, I took care of all that. It's well, yeah, I took care of all that is not the same as actually knowing that you're not going to be in 2.5 years of hiring an attorney and going to court and filing paperwork and on and on and on. So just the details really do matter, and taking their word for it probably isn't longer. Okay, revealed herself to be a person that I was talking about. It was closer to 3 years. Yeah. So takes a while.
Trust but verify, as I like to say. And then think about how illiquid assets are accounted for. So my guess is there's some people here who have siblings. A house is a common asset to leave family members, and it can be problematic if you have that split among multiple people, particularly if you're not living in the same location. So I always like to have that conversation up front is, does everybody actually want to own the house? And if so, what is that going to look like? Are you all agree to rent it? Are you going to sell it? Is someone going to live in it? How are you splitting expenses? Everybody thinks, oh, we'll get the house and we'll split it. But I'm sure Ryan's got stories. I have stories as well. You can go online, Reddit, different places and read, hey, I just inherited this asset with my brother. He doesn't have any money to afford it. I do, but he wants to live there. He doesn't want to pay rent. What happens now? And attorneys happen, and forced sales happen, and really expensive legal bills happen that could be avoided if we just did some planning up front. So I'd say if you have a house, a business, any sort of illiquid asset, you want to have a conversation about how that is actually getting split. And this is where you might have to insert yourself a little more into the conversation with your parents to hopefully avoid a nightmare later. And then also, how are special memorable items handled? I know some people who you'd never think that they wanted the jewelry, even stuff that's not expensive. It's just a sentimental value. Having a conversation about that with your parents can be helpful. And maybe it's as simple as putting something in the will that you flip a coin, someone starts, they get to pick an item, they put a sticker on it, and then you rotate. I've seen that in wills before to handle stuff where it's going to be dicey when someone passes away.
I'm going to raise my hand. Is that a thing? Oh, wait. I did it wrong. My wife's grandmother is 96. She's incredible. She doesn't wear glasses or have dentures or have a hearing aid or literally any assistive technology. She travels 7 hours to the beach with us every year. All that said, 6 years ago when we moved Mimi into her continuing care facility, she lives independently, but she'll be able to get more care at her place. People literally went around with Post-it notes and put Post-it notes on the back of things that are important to them. And she encouraged this. This wasn't like a thing they were doing crudely. And so literally there's a painting on the wall that has a Post-it note on the back that says Carly, because Carly's the person who wants that painting. So it helped people to sort of do all that ahead of time. And realistically, we all thought that 6 years would probably not go by. And I think if I had to bet, she's got another 6. So the Post-it notes might change, but I think having that in the open helps normalize it because it was such a visible, tangible thing that people were doing with her encouragement.
Yeah. And it's going to be uncomfortable when you first bring this up. I think a lot of us internalize that, but I'd challenge you just to do it. As Ryan shared, that can be a helpful thing. I know when my dad passed away, I shared with my mom, she's got a big agate collection. And I was like, hey, I'm an only child, so it's going to come to me, but I expressed how I would enjoy that. And that was a great thing for her. Like, she enjoyed hearing that. That brought her joy. So just know that good conversations can come from this as well. It doesn't all have to be negative and death and dying. DPOA. This is hands down my favorite thing to talk about because it's one of the, I'd say, most ignored documents, but can be one of the most critical and crucial ones for caregiving specifically. And I go on somewhat of a soapbox here on this just because it is that important. I am not a fan of springing power of attorneys. And what I mean by that is there are certain durable power of attorneys out there that are only effective when usually it says 2 physicians declare you incapacitated or incompetent. And most people like the phrasing of that. That's nice in legal land or theoretical land because it's like, hey, this person can't take control of my finances until someone says that I'm incompetent. The difficulty with that is, as we talk about cognitive decline, we talk about aging, it's usually not a bright line. It's not like one day we wake up and I'm incompetent, I'm incapacitated. It's usually, hey, I forgot to pay a bill, or I was found wandering in the street. I couldn't figure out how to drive home. It's small things over time. It's not, hey, I'm in a coma and I clearly can't take care of my finances. That's pretty rare. And so I don't like the springing because most physicians are very hesitant, and rightfully so, to declare someone incompetent because you're essentially taking away their ability to function and have freedom and autonomy. And as a country, whether right or wrong, we've really decided that that is of utmost importance, particularly for people who are aging. I am much more a fan of DPOAs that are effective immediately, meaning the moment that you sign them, someone theoretically could take over your finances if they have the document, they submit that to the institution, and they get added. My reasoning for this is that if you trust the person who you're naming as your agent to take over your finances, when you're incapacitated, you should probably trust them while you have capacity and everything's going well. If you don't, it's probably not someone that you want to name. And so that's something that I would check for your parents' DPOAs. Ask, is it springing or is it effective immediately? And don't just go off the top of the document that says durable power of attorney. Sometimes even those within the document have a certain clause that says it springs when XYZ happens. And so you want to actually read through it and see how that happens. And I just can't stress this enough because I'll give a simple example that when my dad was going through some issues, we found a box of bills, essentially. He just hadn't paid them. It was months. Some had gone to collections, some hadn't. And so I spent a few hours calling all those people. And sometimes they'd talk to me. Sometimes they wanted the DPOA. Thankfully, my dad did not have a springing DPOA. If he had, I would not have been able to talk to them. I would not have been able to pay those bills for him. But because he has had one effective immediately, I was able to knock that box out in a few hours, get them all paid up, and everything was good from that point forward.
And I answered the question, but just to clarify, springing literally means like you don't have power of attorney until something happens, which means, like, for example, in the anecdote that I shared at the beginning, my friend would never have been able to get springing power. Like, if she had had springing power of attorney, by the time her dad had his diagnosis of dementia, it was 5 months after she was aware this was all going on. And in that 5 months, he gave away hundreds of thousands of dollars. So she didn't have any power of attorney, but had she had a springing power of attorney, it would have been effectively worthless in their scenario. So that's why the immediate is, as Elliott said, if you're going to sign over power of attorney to someone, you should probably trust them, period, not just if you are incapacitated. My sister is mine. I would trust her no matter what. And if she needs to step in and do stuff, she will.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Ryan. The other thing I would say for DPOA is to test it. A lot of people, have this document and it never really gets added. Any risks? So the risk with that, as with anything, is you are trusting someone essentially to take your place to manage your finances. So they theoretically could go drain your bank account. They could start making trades in your investment accounts. Basically anything that you can do with your finances, depending on the powers that you give them, they can also do. So it's not without risk, but again, we're trying to name someone that we trust entirely and completely. Ryan, anything you want to add?
No, I mean that's it. It's a balancing of risk, right? Because it is, I can understand if you are the parent in this situation, it can feel as though it's a loss of control. And also if you try to wait until you are starting to lose control, like you're not going to be in the right mindset to actually make the decision at that time. So it's it's a lot. It's a lot to say, hey, child, who I changed your diapers and raised you from birth, I'm actually going to let you have full access to my finances. Like, I understand that's a big bridge to cross, but it's also one that like can prevent so many other issues on the back end. And so, it comes down to many conversations. I think one theme, if I come away from this tonight, is like, you can't talk about this once. This is a 5, 6, 7, 10 different conversations, because for a lot of people, the first time you bring this up with your folks or whoever it is in your life, it's not going to go well, or it might not go anywhere at all. And then you have to try again and try again and try again.
Yeah. It's continually changing. And I just wanted to add real quick, Ryan, on that before we get to the next question. One way I've gotten, I won't say get around, but helped to make it more palatable to set up an effective DPOA that's immediate, is to say, hey, you can set this up. You can tell your kid about this, and then you can put the document somewhere safe, but not necessarily give it to them. So it's there. They could go locate it. That is an option. It's not my preferred option, but it sort of splits the difference in terms of trust or getting to a higher level of, hey, I feel comfortable with this.
There's a question in the chat about making sure all these are notarized. Yeah, they generally should be drawn up by an attorney, and, most of them will have to be notarized, but not all. It really is a state law thing, depending on what the state law is.
Yeah. And I highly encourage working with an attorney to set these up. Some states do have essentially statutory DPOA documents that you can use. The issue is, and it gets down to the kitchen sink powers in this more reading here, is that a lot of people aren't aware of what options can be added in terms of what powers you're giving the agent. I list a couple here: beneficiaries, gifts, digital assets. Some people choose to not allow their agent to change beneficiaries. I like giving this power. I'll give a simple example. I was working with a client one time. We were trying to transfer the assets from another custodian and consolidate accounts, bring it all into one. And though we were keeping the beneficiary the same as what was on the other account, the DPOA didn't specifically list being able to change beneficiaries. And I had to work through an exception process that took a few weeks to actually get the account open. And I wasn't sure for the longest time that we were going to be able to do that. So despite the fact that it was the same, had that power been listed, it would have been much easier to open an account. The other thing is being able to give gifts. So those in states that have lowest state tax exemptions. I'm originally from Washington State. The state tax exemption there is about $2 million, and then above that's taxed. There's good reasons to give someone the power to give away gifts to get below that estate tax, potentially. So that's another important power that sometimes gets left off, or they cap it to the annual exclusion amount. Again, it's everybody's comfort level of what they want to include. But I just mentioned this, and I'd encourage you to read this article. It is geared towards financial planners and those in the industry, but I actually think it's really well written for general audiences to learn about this as well. And then finally, just going back to the second bullet point, test it. When you get the DPOA set up, can you actually transfer money? Like, once it's actually there, I've seen situations where someone gets all set up and then they can't do half the things that they're supposed to. And it's really nice to be able to test this before you actually need it. So if something's not right, or your custodian doesn't accept the document, which sometimes does happen, you can get that corrected before it's too late. Maybe there's cognitive impairment and they're past a point where they can legally sign something. Anything to add, Ryan, before we move on?
Okay. No.
And then finally, for this section, in case of emergency binder, this is what a lot of these things are called online. You can call them whatever you want, but basically a comprehensive place where you keep a lot of these important documents. I had a client I worked with, and this is borrowed from them in the past, where he had a Word document listing all his different accounts, why it was open, the philosophy behind it, money movement, where it was going. And it was a perfect roadmap for when he passed away. He was also diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, for his wife, because she wasn't as involved with the finances, about how to locate everything and really how their financial life ran. And this provided a lot of peace of mind, where she didn't necessarily have to be up to speed right then, but we worked together on this document once he passed away to make sure everything was in order. And there's plenty of other stuff that can be included in there, but I always think about this as the roadmap, that if someone picked up today, let's say you were lying in a hospital bed, could they take over and know where everything is? So this is another thing that you could test, give it to a friend, try it out. Does it actually work? And there's ones that you can pay for out there. You can also just create your own. There's some free templates. I just do that unless you like that format, in which case it's like $40.
Yeah. I have a Google sheet that I have a lot of clients, many of you on this call know this, where we list, where do you have accounts? How much do you have in life insurance? Where is your will? Who is your estate planning attorney? And it's all there. So it doesn't have the passwords, but it has these are all the institutions you might need to contact. So the person isn't stuck, going through your mail or going through your email, trying to figure out like, where does he have a bank account? Where does he have a retirement account? So, I share mine once a year with my sister. And that way, if anything ever happens to my wife and I, there's like a clear, here's the information that you need to take care of what you need to take care of.
Great. So my number one tip on today's call, if you take nothing away, try to get your parents to consolidate. That's custodians, that's banks, that's anywhere that you have financial account. I'll tell a story of a client that she came to me. She was DPOA for another family member and spent probably 1.5 to 2 years tracking down 40 plus bank accounts. And that's not an exaggeration. Still not quite sure they got them all, but I think it's close. So simplify and consolidate. You don't need that extra bank account for that slightly higher yield, for the free ATM withdrawals, whatever it is. I can assure you that whatever incremental you pay or interest you lose out on, you will pay more in your time and trying to navigate that financial institution. Because what people don't realize is that when you pass away, there's paperwork for just about everything to process that. Endless paperwork. You can have things perfectly in order and it's still going to take a ton of time. It's one of my least favorite things to do with clients, just because it's such a burdensome thing. And each custodian, each bank is a slightly different process, and it usually goes to a separate team. And it can take weeks for them to process it. So if that's the one thing you take away, have that conversation. It doesn't have to be immediately, as Ryan talked about earlier. Make the step that maybe you consolidate one account and then you work towards the next one. Custodian.
Good question. Yeah, you answer that.
Great. So basically where your accounts are held. So if you have an account at Charles Schwab or Fidelity, Vanguard, TIAA, those are all custodians. They physically hold the assets. Thanks for that.
Can I say something on this?
Yeah.
I have a client who essentially one parent passed away, and then before all of the paperwork could be done for that parent, his other parent passed away, and his parents had frankly not done very good estate planning. There were missing beneficiaries. There were lots of different accounts in a lot of different places. And when I say we took 15 months where all we did was get on a call once a month and do paperwork, I mean it. Like, it was, today we're going to do the TIAA paperwork. You're going to get that account moved into your name. And then we're going to do the Fidelity paperwork. Now we're going to file the life insurance paperwork. Now we have to do the first thing for the court in Virginia. It was 15 months of, we didn't talk about how he was going to spend any money. We didn't talk about how his life had changed. Like, we had one big picture conversation, and then we had 15 months of bureaucracy and paperwork. So that was one of the things that he said is like, I never want to do that to anybody else. And so he actually does not have children or anything, but he has said like, that is the thing I never want anyone to have to go through, because I experienced it and I never want someone to have to do that if I pass away.
That's a really good story. The next thing I would say, and this is for anybody on this call or really anybody, I have yet to find someone who have not made this recommendation, but freeze your credit at each of the 3 credit bureaus. This is an easy, low-hanging one. And so I operate off the assumption that all of our information is out there and it's free and kind of easily accessible for everybody to have. And this is one way to block opening new accounts. So Ryan's situation earlier where they opened a line of credit, if the credit is frozen at that point, that would have stopped it at that point. Or if you're, at a car dealership and this person has dementia and they're trying to take out a loan for, a new Corvette, that should stop it. And usually if you're at that point, you're going to probably struggle to unfreeze your credit, even though it's a really simple, easy process. Once you have accounts set up, you should be able to unfreeze this at each of the 3 credit bureaus in probably less than 15 minutes. So I'd encourage you after this call, if you don't have it personally, do that. And then also work with your parent to freeze it. This is a really easy, low hanging fruit. And chances are, as you get older, you're not using credit quite as much. So unfreezing it's probably not going to happen too often.
The only thing I'd add is that's one of those things that used to be hard and is now easy. So you might have a parent say like, I did that and it was such a pain. I had to go get a car and it took me 2 weeks and I couldn't get my car. And like, basically after the hack happened, Congress was like, no, you need to make this easy. And they got publicly shamed into making it easy. So I actually don't think it was legislative. I think it was public shaming.
Yeah. Just a quick story on that. My wife and I are currently refinancing our mortgage. And I told the guy, I was on the phone with him, like, give me 2 minutes to unfreeze it. And he didn't believe I could do it. And we had it unfrozen in 2 minutes. So that just gives you an idea of how quickly it is once you have the account set up. And then this one is really important. I've worked with folks where they were very charitably inclined and often got solicitations for charities and other things where they were operating out of a donor advised fund, but then also the wife was giving money away separately from that because she had some cognitive impairment. So I say go through all three of these. Telemarketers throw you on the do not call registry. We know that isn't perfect, but it does help. Opt out of offers of credit and insurance at that second one. And then marketing messages. I would just turn this off for everybody as they age, because it's one more opportunity for them to give money away, to give information in an unsecure way. There's not a lot of upside to getting these, and there's a ton of downside. So when possible, I just say turn it off. And I've actually done this for myself because I frankly don't want any of these messages either. Okay, so we're about halfway through the presentation here. I want to do a quick Q&A for what to do when things are good, and then we'll transition. If we have any questions at this point, we will also have more Q&A at the end. So if you're still thinking, that's also okay. So we'll just take a moment here if you do have any questions.
Anyone wants to either unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, either one is fine. You can also send it just to me or just to Elliott, and we'll read it if you don't want your name attached to it. No questions? We'll do more Q&A towards the end. So if you come up with one for what to do when things are good, please let us know.
Okay.
What to do when a parent refuses to have the conversation at all?
Yeah. So I'm smiling because I was in that point with my dad for the longest time. And that was a really difficult place to be. And I wish I had sort of a magic wand I could just wave and make it better and make your parent listen. I would say accept sometimes that that's where you're going to be. And that's a hard thing to hear. I get that. I've been in that shoes, but sometimes it's just how do you set things up for the mess that your parents are going to leave, but leave it open to the possibility that they might be willing during a crisis. That's an opportunity. I've written about that. I do have some blog posts, but if you're curious, you can go on and read about it. But waiting for a crisis sometimes for your parent to then have that conversation can be helpful. So I'll give the example of my dad. We tried for years, and I mean, literally years, to get him to move to a different living situation, not independently. And we tried and we tried and we tried. Finally, he hit a point one day when he called me out of the blue, essentially crying. And I haven't really ever seen my dad cry. And he said, hey, I need to go somewhere. And I was pretty straightforward and asked a lot of questions of like, hey, if we do this, this is going to happen, just to confirm he was in that state of mind that was okay. And then he was willing to do that. And that was what led to the 48-hour stint in assisted living, which then led to more time at home, but then back into an adult family home at the end of his life where he spent before he passed away. So I would say just be willing to open the conversation as life changes, but it's probably, if you have a really stubborn parent, it might take something happening for you to be able to do that. Ryan, anything you'd add?
Try again. I talk to a lot of clients about this who, they try once, they don't get very far. They try again, they don't get very far. They try a third time and suddenly a little crack comes in, and probably because the parent has experienced something that makes them realize. But I think obviously these relationships can be complicated, but if you are coming from a place of like, I'm coming out of love, I want to help you and I want to help all of us, right? Like I want to make sure the siblings don't end up fighting. I want to make sure that like if you're in a partnership and you're going to pass away before someone else, I want to make sure that person isn't suffering. So you want to frame it not as I'm taking control from you, but as like, how do you prevent problems for the people that you leave behind? How do you make sure that your loved ones who are going to be dealing with this fallout, how do you make sure that it's as easy as possible for them to take the time to mourn you rather than end up in some horrible interpersonal family drama because you didn't take the time to do that? So try again and frame it as much as possible around, the people who that person loves and how to make their lives as simple as possible, even post-death. And then we had a couple more questions coming in. Are there any downsides to freezing your credit? I would honestly say not really. I don't know, Elliott, it takes 2 minutes to unfreeze it. So like the downside is so small and the upside is so big that I generally think people should.
Hey, there was one above that as well that Aletta had.
Yeah, I think Aletta basically asks like, when do you decide when it's time to talk to your kids? So this is a little bit from I think from the older person's perspective. And so like if a lot of the people on this call are also parents themselves, so you might be kind of in two parts of this conversation. But like, when is it appropriate to start talking to your own kids about this?
Yeah. It's tough because every family is a little bit different and each person's maturity is a little bit different in kids. I think having these conversations earlier, even as teenagers, obviously not the type of conversations we're having tonight, but, having conversations about money and what would happen if something happened to you, I think that's a reasonable place to start. And then as they get older, having that conversation, maybe they're in their 20s at this point, and you feel like, hey, they could live up to these life decisions. Maybe I do want to make them durable power of attorney, and I want to have a conversation about what that means for them and the type of care that I would want. I would just feel it out, start the conversation with them and see where it goes. And maybe it goes further, or maybe they're not quite ready for it, or you're not quite ready for it. Ryan, I don't know what you'd add to that.
I think you pretty well covered it. There was another question in here. If you don't want to be left with illiquid assets, I can start on that one if you want, Elliott.
Sure.
So the two illiquid assets. So when we say illiquid, means like not easy to sell. So if you own shares of Apple stock, those can be sold in 2.5 seconds. But we're talking mostly about houses or businesses. I think it's really important to be doing planning with your business partner if you are someone who owns a business. So there's something called a buy-sell agreement, which is essentially, I'll give an example. There's actually someone on this call who's in this situation where if their partner owns a business, you want to make sure that, I'm going to make something up here. Your partner owns a bar, I'm in New Orleans after all. And you don't want to own a bar. You don't know how to run a bar. You have no experience running a bar. You have a whole other set of expertise. You want to make sure that your partner has a buy-sell agreement with the people they own the bar with, so that if they pass away, then essentially what happens in a buy-sell agreement is that life insurance is purchased. The people who own the bar with your partner get a life insurance payout, which is specifically designed for them to then turn around and hand you that money for your shares. So it's essentially an agreement that says, actually, I won't end up the owner of this bar that I know nothing about. I will get paid an appropriate amount of money for my partner's stake, and then the partners can go keep running the bar without, or the other owners can keep running the bar without my partner. So I think it goes back to estate planning, like having, if you're the primary owner of a business, if you're a tiny minority owner, this is different. But if you're the primary owner of a business and there's other owners, you own a third, there should be a buy-sell agreement where all the partners are on the same page of, if one of us dies, how do we buy out the other person's family so we don't suddenly have a business partner who doesn't know anything about this business. Homes, I would say the same thing. Like 5 people can end up owning a home. This gets really into the weeds of estate planning. A lot of parents will, a third, right? We're going to separate my Roth IRA into 3 parts and my traditional IRA into 3 parts and the house into 3 parts. It is actually better to look and say, how could we do this fairly without those complications? So of course it won't work out perfectly, but if you could say, this person inherits the house and my beneficiary for my Roth IRA is this person and my traditional IRA is this person, and there might be tax reasons to choose that for one person or the other, that's probably the best way to do that. Because if 5 people are owning the same house, the odds of one of them not wanting to do what everybody else wants to do are pretty high. So I think there are sometimes some good reasons to say, I'm not going to do my beneficiaries as a third. I'm actually going to give this entire account to one person and this entire account to another person. And that works better for them because of their tax bracket or when they need the money or their expertise or whatever it might be. Those are complicated questions. They're pretty personal, but there are ways to do it. It's like, if we're talking today about like 101 and 201 stuff, I would put that in like the 301.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add on that last question there, if you parents already co-owning family stuff, you could consider a trust and working with an attorney to dictate what happens within that trust, to put some parameters around that. So it's not passing to 5 people individually. You could fund a trust there and spell out all the rules. So we'll keep going then, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're good to go on.
So go ahead and take a moment right now. Think about someone who is aging and it didn't go well. If you've had that situation or you've read an article, if you feel up to it, share it in the chat. Ryan and I have shared tonight, but it's always interesting to hear what other people have gone through. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, Ryan.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let's talk about what do we do in this situation? Now's the time to build your team. You as the caregiver, you can try to do everything. I would say good luck. It's probably not going to work well. I'm a pretty blunt and honest person. I have a lot of experience with all this, and I still hired people. I consulted with an attorney, hired an accountant at times to ask questions. These are people I would have on my team. And just to run down, if you haven't heard about some of these, a daily money manager can actually help pay bills for someone. And that can be a real help if you're running around taking them to medical appointments, you're doing everything else for caregiving. It can be helpful to hire that person out so you don't have to worry about it or take on the responsibility. Sometimes if there's multiple siblings, you don't want to be the one that says, hey, I forgot to pay that bill, and now your sibling's mad at you. You've outsourced that. An elder care consultant, ours was literally life-changing. I would wholeheartedly recommend her to anybody out there. She was local to my dad, but also works virtually. There are other ways to find that. And this isn't someone to place them into an assisted living facility or something else. This is someone who actually works alongside them to help figure out how do you have these tough conversations. So when someone asked earlier about what do you do if a parent is just not open to this conversation at all, we actually hired an elder care consultant years before we introduced her and her team to my dad to help strategize around how we could bring up this conversation with him. And then you're probably familiar with these other folks, but it's just a reminder that you don't necessarily have to file your loved one's tax return. You should probably contact their insurance broker. Chances are they probably haven't reviewed things recently. They may not have the right liability limits on that. Think about this for yourself and the people surrounding you. And how do you make this best for yourself, but also for your loved one? Yeah.
We had a question about elder care consultants. I think most of the other ones on that list, people probably have some familiarity with. Daily money manager, just so you know, it's not that as expensive. There are whole businesses that this is what they do is run the personal finances and make sure your lights don't get cut off, your heating doesn't get cut off, your cable doesn't go out. So that's actually on the scale of things, a relatively easy problem to solve. But elder care consultants, how do you know what they offer? How do you know the right one for you?
Yeah, and this is a really hard one to answer just because there are not a lot of those out there that I would consider good. And it's not a regulated field like a lot of these other ones here. I'm happy to give a recommendation. I've done that in my blogs. Maybe after this call, Ryan, I could send you her information. You could send that out along with the slides. She does work virtually. If you're looking for someone local, I do have a link to a resource that you can type in your local community, and it will give you different options that are part of this organization. But again, you'll have to do a little due diligence to figure out what do they actually offer, how are they billing, and what do they offer. So for example, my elder care consultant that we hired, they have a team that will go in and show you different living facilities in your area, ones that they're familiar with and actually like. In my dad's case, he was a more difficult case. So we were trying to find something that would work with more difficult cases. And they will also help with making sure medication management is followed at the adult family home, for example. Ours just advocated on a lot of different fronts. They were also the team that we went to that if we were just exhausted with something and threw up our hands and said, hey, Krista, this was actually her name, can you handle it? We don't want to handle it. And it could have been as simple as grocery store shopping that day. That's not the best use of it, but that's just an example where we said, hey, that was worth the time and the money.
Quick thing, Cheryl, to your question, daily money manager, I think it's an understandable concern. Someone saying you're going to have access to my checking account. You're going to have access to paying my bills. And this is actually a space where there are some pretty big professionalized businesses that do this. I just dropped a link to the American Association of Daily Money Managers, which is a thing. You probably want to get someone who's on that website, because if they're on that website, they've gone through some screening and they have some oversight, and there's some stakes to them not being someone who's going to steal your money. You definitely don't want it to be just a random person that you found. But there's some oversight in that space. I still think you should probably provide some oversight. Just because you're not doing the daily thing, you should probably go in and review the bank statements every 2 or 3 months and say, does everything make sense here? But daily money managers do have some oversight, though it's not regulated like financial planners.
Yeah. And then now is where you want to get access. So if your parents were resisting before, now's the time to push it a little bit more, whether that's DPOA, view only access, how do we get to their banks, their investments, pensions, other financial accounts, taxes, power of attorney for that, setting that up. So that's all good to go when taxes roll around. insurance portal. The thing that we often forget are utilities. And I ran into this with my dad. This was a mistake we made. He was on a different cell phone plan, was hospitalized, lost his phone. It was really challenging to get that set up. We had to have him sign something, get a copy of his driver's license. I had to drive over to a store. It was a lot of extra time at a time that I didn't want to be doing that. So I always say, if you can, when they're starting to decline, put them on your cell phone plan. As much as you can put things in your name, have bills come to you, whether that's email, at your address, whatever it is. They can be some of the hardest people to work with. And then setting up automatic payments. This is a great time to do that in coordination, maybe with a daily money manager. And then I also like to say setting up a password manager. This is sometimes a hard sell for people. I know I've run into this, but it can be a really nice thing that if something were to happen, you can share those passwords out to your children to help step in and help with that.
Question that came in, Elliott. I dropped a couple of y'all get a password manager. It saves me 5 hours a week of my life. And several of my clients like to just reset their passwords every time they need to log into stuff. And I see that and I'm like, once you switch, it will change your life. Are these people who are directly contracted and working like through your parents, or do they work like this team of people? Will they be working through you as kind of the primary lead, or will they kind of go past you and work directly with your parents or whoever it is that you're caretaking for? We're saying parents as shorthand. We understand it might not be your parent.
Yeah. So let's go back and just look at this list as an example. It's going to depend at, how far are they on this deterioration scale? So if they're like full diagnosed with dementia, they're in a memory care facility, for example, as a financial planner, as an accountant, whoever, they're going to work with you directly, get that DPOA on file to make sure you have the authorization to talk amongst each other. If it's sort of along the way, you might be a middle ground where they're really contracted with your parent, and then you're a part of those conversations and they've given authorization to do that. Usually it starts as everybody's involved and then it just goes to the kids, but it's going to depend again on what is the situation that's going on. And so this is for people who are not in this situation, I've not been in this situation. Phones can be a real problem, even if you have someone who's really great with technology. My dad was one of those folks who was really great with technology. He built computers, he did things like that, but he struggled as his memory went downhill of how to actually make a phone call, or he couldn't move something on his phone. He had a hard time pressing on apps, and he'd keep saying his phone was broken. I can't tell you the number of times that he asked to replace his phone and get a new phone, despite the fact that his phone was perfectly okay. So this might be a time to switch them from a smartphone to Jitterbug is one example. It's a phone designed for seniors. It's larger print. There's less going on. Maybe it's back to a flip phone or a regular phone. There are apps that can simplify that phone. I'd also encourage you to think about, and there's some ethics behind this, but monitoring parents' communication, maybe locating a phone if lost. For example, we installed Custodio on my dad's phone. He ended up losing his phone, and this was an easy way for us to get it back. It also allowed us to monitor some of his communication because he was communicating with some people we didn't want him to be communicating with his substance use issues. So this can be an easy thing to say, oh, my parent is spending an hour every night talking to this phone number. Who are they? I don't know that phone number. Why are they spending an hour talking to them? Is it a love scam or something else that's going on? Obviously go with your own morals and your ethics at this point, but also be protective of your parent.
I dropped it in the chat, but if you like text pictures of your kids, I know that's a common thing is like, if we don't have a smartphone, how do they see my kids? We use a website called Nanogram. I'm happy to send you a referral code, or you can just go to Nanogram. It's amazing. I text pictures to a random number and poof, magically they get printed and mailed to Stephanie's grandmother every month. So she now has an album of 100 photos of my kids that just come to her once a month in the mail. So there are ways to do the things you might want to do that maybe can still happen if you don't have a smartphone anymore. And the upside of having one is maybe not worth the downside, depending on where kind of on the deterioration someone is.
I love that, Ryan. That's awesome.
Yeah. Someone also mentioned an Aura frame. So it's one of those digital picture frames where you can push pictures from your phone and then they pop into that person's living room. Also a good idea.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for sharing that. And then figuring out care. So they're deteriorating. We need to figure out what this looks like. And the biggest thing I would say, we're backing up to boundaries here. Set expectations of what you will do and what you won't do, and revisit that, because what you might be willing to do now is not what you'd be willing to do 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now when things change. And this is a tough one because most people are, I won't say programmed, but want to love as much as possible. And a lot of ways that they show that is by providing care. But if you get burned out and you're unable to care for your own family, for your loved ones, for yourself, you're not going to be a lot of good to other people, whether that's your parent or an aunt or a loved one, whoever it is. And I give the example that I had a hard time, but I stepped away from caring for my dad and just cut off communication entirely because it wasn't serving me and it wasn't serving him. And I was burnt out and mentally in a really bad place. So think about as you give care, whether this is an independent care or an agency. And real quick on that, agencies typically have people under them that are working and they have a lot of backup. So if someone gets sick, sometimes they can send someone else out. Whereas if you hire someone independently, what happens when they get sick? Are you taking that time off work? Are you pulling in another family member? There's pros and cons to that. Independent caregivers tend to be a little bit cheaper. You can establish a little more rapport, but there are some upsides to agencies as well. So you'll just want to explore that and figure out what will work best for your loved one. Think about what happens if someone gets sick. And I like to pose this question because a lot of people have this sort of love affair with aging at home. But for the reality, most of us don't have the resources behind us, whether financially or time-wise, to actually live at home until we pass away. Care gets very expensive. My dad was having people come in. It was through an agency. I think it was like 30 or 40 bucks an hour, but they had certain, I think it was like a 3 or 4 hour window block that you had to sign up for. So he may not need the 4 hours, but you had to sign up for that. Do that a few times a week. Care can get really expensive as you go along. If you start needing care 12 hours a day, 24 hours a day, we can talk about 20 plus grand a month for that care if you can't afford it. The other thing is, as you spend down resources, you may start to qualify for Medicaid. There are certain places that allow you to private pay for 2 years. So that was something we were watching closely for my dad because he was sort of on that resource level where he could maybe private pay for 2 years, but we were starting to spend a lot of money at home. And that meant that at that point, he might just have to spend down for Medicaid instead of trying to go to a nicer facility where he might be able to stay if he spent down his resources.
A question. It's Medicare open enrollment. If anyone is concerned about their parents reviewing plans. Yeah. So Medicare is socialized medicine for those 65 and older. Yay. And so it's open enrollment. And that's something it's a complicated thing and it's very custom to the person which Medicare plans you should be on or not, but it is open enrollment. So it sometimes is worth having a conversation with your parents of like, what plans are you on? What's covered? Why did you choose the plan? Are you on the Advantage plan? Are you not? Why did you choose that? So it's something on the earlier end of the spectrum, hopefully, but it is current. Thank you.
Yeah. And then just knowing costs and the possible progression. And so I mentioned that, if someone has a dementia diagnosis, we more or less know what the outcome is going to be. It's going to be memory care at some point. So planning for that is important. Usually there's a spectrum of what people will experience health-wise, but knowing what the possible routes you could be, what they could cost, that's going to help you decide where is actually the best place to get care for that person, whether it's a continuing care retirement facility, an adult family home, or somewhere else. So is there a list of questions to guide how to vet a facility or caregiver? I don't have a list right now, but I will do my best to come up with something. I would also say this is where you can lean on an elder care consultant because they're going to know what to ask. And in your local community, who are the good ones, who are the bad ones? You can also look up reports. A lot of people will have reports to state agencies. They are regulated, but the odds of one of these getting shut down are very low just because there just aren't enough out there. So even if they are bad, and unfortunately, a lot of them are bad out there, you can at least look up reports and see, hey, is that a flag that I'm worried about? I remember reading one. There was, I think, an old sink in the backyard where no one really went. I'm not really worried about that. But, if someone was lying in their bed and had bed sores for days because they weren't turned over, that's something I'm more concerned about. I would say the biggest thing is schedule a tour, but then also see if you can show up at a random time just to get a sense for what does it look like? Is the food good? What do other, have conversations with other residents? Are they having a good time? Or are they not having a good time? Trust your gut as you go through this process. And I'd say don't make a quick decision. And you could do it today. It's one of those things where you don't necessarily have to wait until you have a crisis. You could go tour local facilities just to say, hey, I really liked that one. That could be a possibility when things do go bad.
Yeah. This is a really tricky thing in that I would say There's kind of a barbell, which is to say, if your parent qualifies for Medicaid, which means they have very few resources, not much in the bank, and there's a whole, we can't get to it tonight, a whole category of Medicaid planning, which is planning to get on the federal system that does long-term care. So Medicare, which is healthcare for older Americans, does not cover long-term care. Medicaid, which is a program for those with much fewer resources, is the program that covers that. There's access there, but it's very complicated and the facilities don't tend to be the best. It's an option for a lot of people, but it is not necessarily an ideal option. We go to the other end of the barbell. If you're in a major American city, it is not uncommon for care to cost $15,000 or $20,000 a month. There's not all that much in the middle, unfortunately. So there are some people who have the resources to pay. I have a friend whose mother passed away last year and they were paying $15,000 in Washington, D.C. every month. And it was a wonderful facility, but they were paying $15,000 a month. And so it's unfortunately something where you kind of have to go out and tour and put a lot of legwork in, but there's kind of two ends of the spectrum. And the middle is like, you can find some, but they're not easy to find. Long-term care insurance. Is long-term care insurance a thing? That could be a whole webinar. I'm going to defer to Elliott because it's not an area of expertise for me, but it's kind of a thing.
I will try to keep this short. Yes, it's a thing. Yes, you can use it. Everybody has different opinions on this. I will say the one thing that I really like about long-term care insurance that I appreciate and I think is the biggest benefit is people bring in care sooner. I see that with policies because they're trying to extract benefits from that as soon as possible. Whereas if they don't have it, someone, usually spouse, tries to give care for as long as possible. They get burnt out mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is. Is it going to cover all of your long-term care expenses? Depends what you need. That's a very personal decision. All that to say, it is a thing. You can explore it. Personal decision.
I will add, and I have a negative slant on this, and it can work great for some people. It's pretty expensive. We're talking multi-$1,000 a month premiums. Like just to have the insurance can cost a couple $1,000s a month. And then the person I was just talking about who was in Washington, D.C. paying $15,000 a month did have long-term care, but didn't actually qualify to get any benefits from her long-term care at any point along the way to her death, because there are basically, it's called activities of daily living. It's like going to the bathroom, feeding yourself, dressing yourself, all those things. She was able to do those things. And because she was able to do those things, she didn't actually get any benefits from her long-term care policy. So they can be good in some situations. I think it's a thing to at least discuss in your 50s or 60s. There is a kind of small middle ground of people who can afford the premiums and also can't afford to just pay the $15,000 a month. So I would say it's not a huge number of Americans that can financially afford it, but there are some people it's beneficial for.
And then that gets to places where you can receive care. And these are important options to explore and just to be familiar with. We talked about home. Home can be a good place when you don't need a lot of care. You can still get around pretty easily. I think as you need higher levels of care, I think that gets harder at home unless you have significant resources. There are certainly ways to do it, but it's probably going to be more effort on your loved ones and yourself to set that up appropriately. And there's probably going to be more gaps on that. Because if we compare that to assisted living, you're at a location, care essentially is there full time to help you. And you can pay for different levels. It might be $7,000 a month. And then if you need help with medication management or bathing, showering, eating, other things, it might start to get a little more expensive. Adult family homes can be good. Typically, there's somewhere between 4 and 8 residents, depending on the size of the home. And there might be 1 or 2 caregivers in the home to provide that care. As I mentioned, that's where my dad ended up. That was really his only option at the end. We had a facility that was willing to accept him, but it was really financially motivated. I remember getting on the phone with them. He was in the hospital. The social worker was essentially trying to kick him out as much as possible, and we were pushing back. And the first question this person said who owned this home was, he's private pay, right? No hello, no nothing. He's private pay, right? So that just goes to show you what the situation can be out there, whether you have the resources or not to pay for that. And it's not a knock on adult family homes. This is just the one that was willing to accept him. There are great adult family homes out there that can work really well for people. All of these can work better for different people and what's going on. And then finally, memory care. The major difference between this and the other facilities, this would be dementia cases where it's actually a locked facility. They cannot walk out, whereas the other ones, they can walk out. They're free to leave at any time. So we've been through a lot tonight. What is your biggest takeaway? I'd love to hear that if you don't mind dropping it in the chat. What did you get out of tonight?
Get a DPOA, simplify. I think that's a huge one. Yeah, it's
It is
possible.
all possible.
It's really important because it can seem daunting, but it is possible to do this well. I have seen both ends of the spectrum personally, where it's gone well and where it hasn't. And like, it's possible to do this with dignity, with care, with love, and do it well. It takes a lot of effort, but it can be done well.
Yeah, these are all great.
Start the conversation even when they're uncomfortable. It's great.
Yeah.
Getting a binder set up.
Definitely multiple paths, and your paths may change as things go along.
Freezing credit for a loved one who, I know, Carol, you shared this in the chat, so I don't mind saying it, but someone who's already sort of on this path of not doing as well. Figuring out an elder care manager. Yeah. Persistence. Some family members are more receptive than others.
Yeah. Aaron, you had a good point. Striking at their heart. I always like to talk with people of parents usually, I think, have a framework of, I don't either want to be a burden on my kids or I want to perfectly control the process and want things good for me. That's usually where I see things where you can frame it as, hey, you don't want to be a burden on me. Here's what I need. If they work from that perspective, or I want to make sure I respect what you want. What do you want done to make sure that I can honor those wishes?
Things may not go as planned. I think it was important to say, Elliott and I sit in this chair of watching people oftentimes in these situations. So we have stories, and we have stories that range the gamut from like this beautiful thing where family connected. In fact, I'll share a quick story here. I know someone who is a financial planner today because they had a good end of life care with a financial planning or experience. So the financial planner jumped in, kind of quarterbacked, coordinating two siblings around end of life care for a parent, made sure the siblings were on the same page, made sure they understood what was going on, helped coordinate a team. And like it was so inspiring that it led to that person actually changing careers and becoming a financial planner. That's the extreme edge of like, it went really well for all the parties involved and was like a deeply moving experience. There's a big range. That's one end of the spectrum, and there is another end of the spectrum, but starting early helps. I saw a few more comments come in. Give the gift to my kids of figuring this out as early as possible. Thank you. That's so important. And I know a lot of the people on this call are thinking of this as the person who will be managing, but also like I'm thinking of my own kids, and like I am going to be neurotic about this. I am going to talk to them about my death over and over and over. Not now, they're 7 and 4. But at some point, because I just want to make sure that they never end up in one of those horror situations that you hear about.
Yeah. Great. So let's jump into the last part of the Q&A, and then we've got some resources at the end. But if we have any other questions lingering, now is the time.
There was a person who said there's continuing care facilities where you can start. Yeah. I'll speak to this personally. Mimi, who is my wife's grandmother, so she's 96. My kid's great grandmother, she's in a continuing care facility. We moved her in there 6 years ago. She lives independently. She has a kitchen. We went and visited her this summer. She's got a kitchen, an apartment, bathroom, all of her own space. And she will be able to live in that building through continuing care all the way up. It's not cheap, but it could be a nice transition for people where that they can build a community. She got in trouble during COVID twice for sneaking out of her room to play cards with her friends, and got COVID twice and was fine at 92 years old. Just to say, continuing care facilities can be a good place if you have the resources to pay for them. Questions in the chat. Any other questions? I know we've done a bunch along the way.
Well, I'll see if any come up, but I'll just keep going here. There's 2 more slides. Oh, yeah. Staying sane as an only child.
I think there's pros and cons to doing this as an individual versus with a group. I think let's answer the question as an only child. And I would say also then I have some thoughts as a person with 3 siblings.
Yeah. So, I mean, the easy thing is, besides my mom, which we were on the same page most of the time, whatever we say kind of goes to the extent that we have that control. So that makes it easier. I've also worked with people where it's 5 siblings in a room and everybody has a different opinion of what should happen. And you just have ongoing conversations where really nothing gets done. So I'm kind of thankful as an only child. Obviously, all the burden and everything fell on me other than my mom, but it did make things easier.
And I would say from the sibling perspective, I've done a couple of times where I've done meetings with whole families where it's been like me, the parents, and 3 kids, or me, the parents, and 2 kids. And in one case, me, the parents, and 5 kids. And it's really important that you start that early so that everyone's on the page. They know what the parents' resources are. They know what the risks are. They know, like, are they going to need support from us? Are they going to leave an inheritance? What are their wishes? Do they want to age at home? If they want to age at home, do they have the money to age at home? So it's more complicated when there are multiple siblings involved, surely, because there's, interpersonal things, and, you become 8 and 4 years old all over again. But there's also more people to help. So someone can be the money manager, and someone can be the person who goes to the appointments, and someone can be the person who does this. So there's a divvying up. So it's neither one is better or worse, but I think it is probably a more lonely experience, but also maybe a little bit more streamlined experience if you're an only child. We had the question of what's the first step when a crisis hits? And I'll let Elliott take that one.
I would back up a point before that and hopefully say that you've already talked to an elder consultant or have someone, so that way you can turn to them when you don't know what to do and say, hey, this just happened. What am I going to do right now? We did that plenty of times where something happened. We're like, shoot, I don't know what we should do next. Other than that, I would say make a list of priorities that you have or priorities that your parent has shared or your loved one, and then start to figure out what it should be. I think anything that we talked about on today's call is important. So it depends on the crisis, right? If something happened drastically health-wise, maybe it's setting up that DPOA that hasn't gotten set up, or it's consolidating an account. Pick something that's going to cause a lot of pain later on and try to chip away at it would be my best advice.
A question of if your spouse has POA for their parents, but you're kind of the more administrative, like financially savvy person, how can you navigate it if you're trying to help your spouse, even if your name's not in the documents?
Yeah, so that's going to be a tougher one just because you're not supposed to be really doing anything with that if you're not the DPOA, but you could certainly research things. So like, if you're not the DPOA, you could be researching different financial institutions or different places that they could go live. I think a lot of times when you're not the person actually doing it, research is going to be one of the best things that you can do to help line up the options of here are the things that we could do, and then make that decision as a family and have that person actually go sign the paperwork to do the thing, whatever it is that you're trying to do.
I have a thought on that one. And then there's another one, which is, this is not legal advice at all. Once you have POA and you have online access, I know people on this call have their spouse's logins and credentials. I'm not saying you should, but I'm saying I know people do. So like if it's something as simple as logging into an account to check over the last month of expenses and make sure there's nothing weird in there, like you can probably do that just by having a login and password. So there are some things you can do even if your name's not on there. We had an anonymous question. I think this is a really important one. If bringing all this stuff up would harm the relationship we have with our parents, should we consider not doing so and just enjoying the time we have? Or is it worth it despite the major headaches that it's going to bring?
Your loved one. I would leave that in your hands to trust your gut there. Without knowing the relationship, without knowing anything, it's tough for me to say. I always err on the side of I want to try to bring it up in a soft way to make maybe some progress. But if you're of the mindset, hey, this isn't going to go well at all, this is going to totally ruin my relationship, I don't think any of this is worth throwing away for that, because you can always clean up the mess later. As long as you're willing to live with those consequences, then that's your decision to make.
I think that's a perfect phrasing. Like, is the pain involved in trying to have this conversation more or less than the pain involved in cleaning up a messy situation on the back end? And there are 2 answers to that. There's really not just one answer. There are 2 questions that have come in. How do DPOAs work? So that's power of attorneys, durable power of attorney. How do they work in real life? If you need to, for example, move money to a different account, you just take that document to the bank. Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, so I'm smiling because this can look different at different financial institutions, and this is one that it can be a pain. So one of the custodians that I work with sometimes, and other custodians out there, it can be tough to get added because certain times their legal departments are more or less conservative. Think about this from the bank's perspective. They don't want to give anybody access to accounts that shouldn't have access. So they're going to scrutinize these documents. very thoroughly. Some even have their own DPOA paperwork. So I always encourage folks that if you can, and someone's willing and able and mentally okay to do it, just do the DPOA paperwork. This isn't legal advice. Consult with your attorney here. But I do find it's easier sometimes just to do the DPOA paperwork for the financial institution that's specific to them to get set up, because that could be as simple as getting set up in a couple of days, whereas you might give them the DPOA and they might take weeks to review it, even though technically they don't actually have weeks to review it and should review it sooner. But actually take that to the bank, set it up, then that gets you online access. Again, depending on whether you do that paperwork or have your own, it might go through a lengthy process before you get approved for that. And then you should get online access where you can then move money or do other things. Again, each financial institution is going to be differently in how they set this up. So it's hard for me to say exactly this is how it works. But in my dad's case, for example, small credit union, I couldn't actually get online access. They didn't have that for DPOAs. Major financial institution, they did have online access, and that just got listed under my accounts, could move money super easy. And that's why it's hard to say exactly what that would look like for you.
I would add, going back to Elliott's number one takeaway, consolidate, consolidate, consolidate. Like, the reason that would be hard is if you have 8 different financial institutions. If you have 2 or 3, and like I truly believe most people can have 2 financial institutions, like a bank and an investment custodian. We've got a few questions coming in here, and I want to make sure we also respect people's time. So we're going to go through these a little quick, but we'll try to follow up. Advice on how to not spend your own money while working through all of this after your parents are sick, dying, have passed away, and how do you balance, the classic sandwich generation of like, do I spend my own money to help my parent while I'm also thinking about funding college for my children, and kind of how do you walk those lines?
Yeah, this is where it's important to plan with an elder care consultant. I'm of the mindset that if you are on a path to spend down towards Medicaid, which depending on the situation, many people could find themselves in, I would not be spending your own money on anything, just because if you spend it, it's inevitably your money that's going away that Medicaid might actually pay for something along those lines. If you're in that situation, if you're just trying to help out here and there, then maybe potentially we were in a situation where we really didn't pay for much. We paid for it out of my dad's account, or we paid for it and then got reimbursed for that and then kept proof of that in case he was spending down to Medicaid. So I'd be very cautious about paying for parents, but that's just my personal beliefs on this. You have to live with the relationship that you have with your parents and how to best navigate that.
And it truly depends on how much resources they have. Like, I know I've seen a situation where people had a joint checking account with 3 siblings' names on it, and the 3 siblings were funding it every month, monthly deposits. A couple more questions. Is there a downside to being added as an account holder, like a joint account holder, if your parent's willing to? So they've got a checking account and they change it from Ryan's checking account to a Ryan and X person's checking account.
Yeah. So I'll answer that question.
That can be a little complicated. Go ahead.
I just want to add one more thing, Ryan, to the one before this, particularly if you have siblings. If you start paying for things, that can also get complicated and animosity can happen at the end of life. Your parent might say, hey, we're going to equalize inheritances at the end of life. Maybe you paid 50 grand or 100 grand for their care. That might not get equaled out at the end of life. So that's just something else to be aware of if you're paying for a parent. In terms of adding people to accounts, I'm not a fan of that. I think you should get added as a DPOA or a POA or however you manage that, just because you're introducing legal liability. Like, let's say you're driving down the street, you hit someone, you get sued, you're now a joint account holder with your parent. That asset can be brought into that court process, or you go through a divorce, that can also be processed. That's going to be on the asset and liability statement. So it's a very easy thing to do. It's an easy way to pass money on, but a much better system is to do a DPOA or a transfer on death, other estate planning techniques where you're not having that asset actually get transferred in a way.
One more question and then we're going to wrap. But if you send more questions, Elliott and I are happy to answer via email. If there's some account they forgot about, they never told you about, what happens with that money? Does it go to like the state's unclaimed property? What happens if you don't know about all their accounts?
Yeah, after a while, it will get escheated to the state, meaning it moves to the state, and then you can go to a place like Missing Money, I think it's .com, and type in your name. And I'd actually encourage everybody on this call today to just throw your name into that or your state's unclaimed property database and look to see if there's something that maybe is missing for yourself or your parents or some other loved one.
I just dropped in unclaimedproperty.org. Way back in the day, we found like $50 of mine that I had lost in Mississippi in 2007. Not life-changing, but I've had clients find, I worked at a school for 1 year. I forgot about it. I put money in a 403B. It was 16 years ago, and they find like $2,300. Not everybody, obviously, but unclaimedproperty.org. Each state keeps essentially a lost and found of financial assets too. So you can Google your state plus unclaimed property, and you'll probably find a state-specific website. Let's wrap.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Just be kind to yourself. I think this is a helpful thing that we think grief sort of minimize itself, just a visual representation. And this is my play on someone else's work here of how you sort of build a garden around that. I think this is helpful to come through as you navigate your own caregiving journey. And then resources really quickly. I've got a blog out there, lots of different articles, some specific to caregiving, some not. This is the organization I mentioned earlier in terms of finding an elder care consultant. Not all of them are on there. I'd also do a Google search for your local area. I'm also happy to provide you the name if you want to work virtually with the woman that I engaged with. A book out there that you could read. AARP's got some great caregiving resources. They've also got a Facebook group. I will say that this is a pretty depressing place to be if you're not in the right mindset to go read about that. So just take that with a grain of salt before joining. Area Agency on Aging has a lot of local resources to help you, and each area has a different agency on aging, but that's a good place to start in terms of resources. If you're just like, hey, I don't know where to begin, that's a good place. Other resources also for that. Find help, particularly for people who are lower income. This can be a way to plug in your zip code and get connected to resources, particularly as you age. Cost of care, this is a great calculator. I'd increase, because these are from a few years ago, maybe increase these 10 to 20% because these tend to be off and maybe a little bit lower, but at least a good place to start if you're trying to hire in-home care, assisted living, continuing care, retirement facilities, that sort of thing. And then how to talk about end of life, the conversation project down here. So lots of different resources. I'll send this to Ryan. He can send it out as well.